Hello, everyone. This is Devin Thorpe for GoodCrowd.info. Holy cow! I almost said I was talking to you for someone else, but this is welcome to the Your Mark on the World show. We have one of my all-time favorite guests is back with us today. This is Richard Swart, the Director of Research on Crowdfunding at the University of California, Berkeley's Fung Institute. Richard, thank you very much for joining us.
Always happy to be on your show, Devin.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. Let's be clear about that. Clearly, in this world of crowdfunding, there are very few people who are as nuanced and as informed and as articulate as you are, so it's always great to have you join us. You were just in Africa, I understand. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing and what you see the potential for crowdfunding being in Africa.
Yeah, I was actually doing two things. One of my friends runs a foundation there, and he invited me to make a presentation to 50 NGO directors. And I was in Kenya, and the president's office in Kenya pulled together a group of 50 NGOs, and I guess there's thousands of them, so I'm not sure how they selected the 50 that they chose. And I presented on the opportunity for crowdfunding as a sustainable funding model for NGOs, and talked about some of the changes in philanthropy and how crowdfunding is probably going to disrupt the whole foundation to NGO to donor model. And been invited back several times to continue the conversations there in Africa. And then the other part is the World Bank is sponsoring a pilot project looking at how to use crowdfunding for the development of climate and clean energy technologies and renewable energy. And there's an accelerator in Nairobi that trains African entrepreneurs to develop clean energy technologies. And so I was there to help evaluate and essentially provide feedback to the World Bank on how effective the training program is and how we can improve it.
Fantastic. That's really great stuff. So you were there doing that. What is your take? Is there an opportunity for crowdfunding to really make a difference for African NGOs and for this, especially sub-Saharan Africa, as they try to accelerate economic growth and lift people out of poverty?
It's going to be a long haul, but yes, there is an opportunity. There's a couple of challenges that need to be addressed. First, of course, are the huge regulatory and policy issues that exist there. You have a patchwork quilt of regulations, and you also have regulations on paper and regulations in practice, and some are enforced, some are not. So it becomes a little bit of a dicey situation when it comes to equity crowdfunding. Donation rewards crowdfunding is alive and well, and there have been several successful campaigns, mostly on Indiegogo because of their openness to international campaigns. You don't really have Kickstarter in Africa, but none of them have been wildly successful. They've all, raised a few thousand, 10,000, which is still, a good thing, but it's not quite as big as it could be. There's some initiatives that are going to be started in the next few months to look at how to make explicit linkages between diaspora investors and African companies, and that's going to be a large-scale project I'll be part of as well. So I think the opportunity is there, but it's really taking a model which is a little bit unusual. There's a lot of concerns over fraud. People are not quite as good at self-promoting. A lot of the discussion in Africa is framed in terms of developmental economics or impact or charitable work, and it's not framed in a very quick and easy to understand soundbite that plays well in social media and plays well in crowdfunding. There's some shifts that are going to have to occur, but the African continent is on fire. There's a lot of economic activity. The number of 747s flying into the airport blew my mind. I mean, it's amazing how many people are coming to Africa, how many businesses are already there. And I was very impressed with the people. I mean, they're incredibly high-quality entrepreneurs. There's some really good business models. Just need to help them figure out how to tell their stories better and make better linkages.
That's great. It is exciting because there's so much need in that area. Then it runs the gamut, as you say, from nonprofit charitable operations to entrepreneurial things that would help employ and impact those communities. So exciting to see your work there. I want to shift gears just a little bit. In the U.S. here, one of the things that really created the excitement around crowdfunding was the legalization of investment crowdfunding with the Jobs Act in 2012, which is now nearly 2.5 years ago since it was passed. The law was passed 2.5 years ago, but it required the SEC to issue regulations that have not yet been issued under Title III that enables crowdfunding. What do you think is going on there, and what do you think the impact is going to be of those regulations finally being issued when they are?
It depends on what the final regulations look like. If they're fairly close to the proposed rules, there's going to be some serious problems because of the issues around liability of platforms that are inherent in the rules. I think the costs are too high. So if I waved my magic wand or got my crystal ball out, I would expect that you would see some activity at smaller funding levels. Very few people choosing to try to fund them with $500,000 because of the increased compliance risks and costs. So I think the current structure of the rules is pretty broadly acknowledged to not be optimal. I'm not going to say it's totally broken, but it's certainly far from optimal. So if, in fact, some of the initiatives being done by Ron Miller and others to get the SEC to act work, excuse me, then I think you'll see a flurry of activity fairly quickly, but I don't think a really strong industry will grow until there are some structural changes to the rules. Now, I know from conversations I've had on the Hill that there are several very concrete proposals and ideas floating around about what those changes should look like, but obviously we're about to enter our elections here in the U.S. and not much is going to happen until we see where the chips fall. I think if we see a change in leadership in the Senate, you will definitely see some amendments to the Jobs Act and things that I think the industry will be happy about.
Richard, what are some of the gaps that you see between the legislation and the draft rules? Most of the rules seem to me to be consistent with the legislation, not leaving the SEC with much wiggle room to make much in the way of changes. What are the opportunities you see to make improvements over the draft rules in final rulemaking?
I think the number one is just clarifying the issue of liability. There was some draft language inserted by one of the staffers that implied that the platforms would have an excessive liability, and I think that has to be clarified. And I actually met with the rulemaking committee and had a long discussion. I know that their primary concern is investor protection and investor education, and that's what's driving most of their decisions right now. I think that this was more of a well-intentioned staffer not necessarily thinking through his or her comments sufficiently. And I made that point very clearly when I met with him back in June. So I think the essential problem is that the legislation was so restrictive. The compromise bill that emerged from Congress tie the SEC's hands. But I'm being optimistic and assuming the SEC would want to fashion something that works. So assuming that's true, then I think they're really hamstrung by the actual language of the Act at this point.
But the Act itself doesn't create this liability issue that concerns you most, right?
No, it's not implicit. It's in the proposed rules.
But not in the Act. So that's probably the biggest opportunity for the SEC to improve on its draft rules in the final rulemaking. A lot of the other things that I know people have complained about are in the law, and I don't see the SEC departing much from the law, even where they have some limited authority to do so. So it's an interesting idea there. Now, Richard, you have one of the most influential events of the year is the Berkeley Symposium on crowdfunding. It's really a kind of an elite group of people that get together there to talk about crowdfunding in a global sense. Tell us about this symposium. It's next week, right?
Right. It starts next Thursday, a week from today, 9/11. It's called the second annual Berkeley Symposium on Crowdfunding Research and Policy. So it really looks at crowdfunding from the perspective of academics and policy directors and government agencies. So to just give you some perspective, we have faculty from 4 continents, I think 11 nations, presenting papers. We have faculty from several elite universities around the world coming. In addition, we have government minister-level representatives from, I believe, 5 countries will be in attendance. We have the senior policy director for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. We have the representatives of the SBA, Commerce, Treasury, many government agencies here in the U.S. We don't have politicians by design, nor will the SEC attend in an informal capacity because of the ongoing rulemaking. But we're seeing a fairly high level of interest from a number of governments and government agencies. The U.S. government has issued 2 contracts in the last 12 months for crowdfunding research. More are coming down the pipeline. People are starting to recognize this is a very serious, potentially game-changing set of dynamics, and especially following the lead of Europe. And we have to acknowledge that the European Commission and the European Crowdfunding Network are probably at least 2 years ahead of the U.S. in their thinking and their policy making around crowdfunding. So we have obviously some Europeans here as well. So I sort of jokingly call it the Davos Conference of Crowdfunding. It's government ministers, CEOs, directors of companies, heads of foundations, and academic researchers, and we intentionally break the model of an academic conference. So we have like alternating panels of academic researchers presenting papers on their original research. And then we'll have an industry panel of thought leaders from around the world talking about specific issues, with the idea being that the 2 of them have to learn from each other, and we don't have time for the academics to publish their papers and then the policy makers to read those papers in 2 or 3 years. There has to be an ongoing communication. And then we very carefully invite a select group of people from the industry to come. And I don't want to say this wrong, if you will, the wise old men and women who have been in the game for a while and really have a deep understanding of what's occurring. So we try to inform the policymakers by having access to the people that are actually launching platforms and launching initiatives.
Well, fantastic. I think it's going to be a great event. I'm grateful for the opportunity you gave me to participate in the program as well. I'm excited to be there.
Well, your work is great, and a large part of what's happening is what's the role of crowdfunding for social impact investing, philanthropic giving. And there's multiple discussions around crowdfunding. It's not just about startups and early stage capital. So
right.
It's a very important conversation.
Well, Richard, similarly, I'm excited to have you come speak at the at what we're calling Good Crowd 14, the Social Enterprise and Crowdfunding Conference at Snowbird on September 26th here in Utah. You were my co-founder in launching that conference last year. It was a big success last year and looks to be even bigger this year. So I'm grateful that you would come again and speak because, again, you bring remarkable insight.
Well, thank you. It's an important conversation, and I'm glad you've been able to organize a lot of the social impact community and get them to recognize that this is I think a disruption in their models. And it's going to be very impactful.
It is. I think one of the crazy things is that a lot of the crowdfunding concepts come out of the nonprofit sector. A lot of the tips, tools, and practices that are used on Kickstarter, Indiegogo, and around the internet on crowdfunding sites come out of that nonprofit sector. And yet the nonprofits themselves are coming to modern crowdfunding rather slowly, and they tend to be somewhat afraid. And I think that comes from the fact that most nonprofits are under-resourced and therefore don't have the opportunity to spend money on training and technology, and so they are intimidated by those things. What do you think? Are you seeing the same kind of dynamic in your experience?
I don't get a lot of calls from nonprofits, and when I do, they tend to be really large, multinational charities or things like that. But I agree with you on the resource allocation issue. And then secondly, they perceive it as a fundamental threat in many ways, that they believe that crowdfunding may replace the value that they bring to the relationships, and they're afraid of donors being able to reach out to aid recipients without the need for the not-for-profit. And I flip it and say it's actually a great way for you to demonstrate value and engagement and provide transparency and accountability into those relationships that won't happen otherwise. But I think you're right. There's a resource allocation issue. There's also a marketing sophistication issue. And then there's also just a fear of this new disruption, which may threaten the way they've been doing business for decades. And unfortunately, the change is already happening. The change is here, and they're going to have to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I sure appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. It's just an honor and a joy to catch up with you. I appreciate the great work you're doing there at Berkeley and with the Crowdfund Capital Advisors. I know you're a partner there, and I appreciate your leadership in the crowdfunding community and taking the time to be on the show today. So thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
All righty. Let's do some good.
Okay. Thanks.